Good evening. I'm Patrick Lewis, Director of Collections and Research at the Filson Historical Society. Thank you again for joining us for Fighting for Health at Waverly Hills Sanatorium. Dr. Lynn Pohl received her Ph.D. in history from Indiana University, Bloomington, and is a collections cataloger at the Filson Historical Society. She's the author of Waverly Hills Sanatorium, a history, which is available for purchase after the lecture over there. Don't leave without one. And has published articles on the history of race and medicine in the American South. She taught history at colleges in Asheville, North Carolina, and Louisville before joining the staff of the Filson 5 years ago. At the Filson, she catalogs Jewish and general manuscript collections and photographs. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Lynn Pohl.
Right. Thank you, Patrick. Thanks to all of you for coming out here tonight, and those of you who are tuning in from home. A cold winter night, I think, is an appropriate setting for a talk about Waverly Hills Sanatorium, considering how much time patients spent outside in their beds on porches throughout the year. Thick robes, stockings, slippers, and pajamas were among the items most requested by sanatorium patients in their letters home and in appeals for help. I want to focus tonight on the experiences and stories of people connected to Waverly Hills Sanatorium. Those who supported the institution that opened in 1910 for the treatment of tuberculosis, those who were patients there, and those who worked there. My aim is to look at both individual struggles as well as broader medical and social developments. To examine a history that was quite distressing, but also remarkably dynamic, shaped by many big changes over time. And we're going to start in the early 20th century, when tuberculosis ranked as the #1 cause of death in Louisville and in cities across the United States. Just 20 years earlier, in 1882, the German physician Robert Koch had identified the specific bacterium as a causative agent of tuberculosis. And this is a groundbreaking discovery. It contributed to the realization that certain diseases were caused by specific microscopic germs. Tuberculosis was a major killer in the United States throughout the 19th century. It usually affected the lungs, but it could also infect other parts of the body, and it had many names that it was known by through the centuries. Many believed it to be hereditary. Koch's discovery showed that tuberculosis was contagious, spread by bacteria in the spit or sputum of patients with active cases of tuberculosis. His discovery provided the microscopic means to help diagnose the disease and knowledge about how to control its spread. Here in Jefferson County, the Louisville Anti-Tuberculosis Association was formed in 1905. It was actually founded by the name Kentucky Anti-Tuberculosis Association, and it would later rename itself the Louisville Tuberculosis Association. So don't get confused by all the different names I use. This is a private organization which focused primarily on educational campaigns to teach the public about germs and contagion. And these were still new concepts to many people in the early 20th century. So here on the right are one of their graphics, actually from a bit later in 1938, showing how tuberculosis germs were passed from person to person. So these early 20th century campaigns basically were trying to teach the public new health habits, telling them, stop spitting in public, stop sharing cups, start opening your windows, and consult a physician if you have a persistent cough. The Louisville Anti-Tuberculosis Association also helped establish 2 sanatoriums in Jefferson County in the early 20th century. One was Hazelwood Sanatorium, a private institution that opened in 1907, just north of what is now Iroquois Park. The other was Waverly Hills Sanatorium, which was managed by the Board of Tuberculosis Hospital, funded by new local taxes, and was meant to provide free treatment to local residents diagnosed with tuberculosis. Proponents saw sanatoriums as both preventative and curative. They were seen as somewhere to isolate patients from the public in these very highly regulated institutional settings, where those patients were given fresh food, fresh air, lots of rest, and nursing care. And all of this had the aim of trying to help patients overcome that bacterial infection in their lungs. The Board of Tuberculosis Hospital purchased the Waverly Hill land in 1908, in early 1908, located in the southwestern part of Jefferson County. This property provided both the name and the land for the sanatorium about to be opened. This is a picture of the Hayes family home, and it would serve as a nursing home once the sanatorium opened. The Board of Tuberculosis Hospital also hired local architect J.J. Gaffney to design the original buildings. So here we see what consisted of Waverly Hills in 1910, which was this main administration building in the middle, and then a patient pavilion on each side. At its opening in the summer of 1910, there were 20 beds in each pavilion. One was for white men and the other was for white women, all with early cases of tuberculosis. In future months and in future years, the number and types of patients admitted to Waverly Hills and the number of beds and buildings would expand rapidly. Here on the top left is an inside view of the men's pavilion, with men looking a bit bored. This photo is part of a remarkable collection of over 150 photographs that were donated to the Filson in early 2019. They were donated by the grandson of Edward Arthur, who was a business manager at Waverly Hills in the 1920s, and also a patient who died there in 1929. He's pictured on the right, on the top, in the right photo, in the top left, the one with the bow in his hand. This photo is of a string band made up of Waverly Hills employees and patients. I bring these photos up in every talk I give about Waverly Hills, first because they were just such a remarkably delightful group of photos, and second because they prompted me to more deeply research, to do research into the history of Waverly Hills, leading to the publication of my book. The children's playground in front of the children's pavilion was one of the most popular spots for photos. The children's pavilion opened right next to the women's pavilion in 1916, and it opened to white children who were also provided formal education at the sanatorium. The collection also includes a photo of the hospital for advanced cases that opened in 1913. Now, this wooden building was located about a quarter of a mile downhill from that original administration building and those two pavilions that we looked at earlier. This building had 4 wards with porches on each side. So it had one ward each for white males, white females, Black males, and Black females. And the history of this building is long. During its 45 years housing patients and later employees, it was part of a separate world at Waverly Hills. After opening with 50 beds, it quickly housed, as soon as 2 years later, over 100 patients. So just imagine these photos of a ward and a porch, and imagine 3 times or more beds squeezed into this space. Death rates among advanced cases at this hospital were high. In its first few years, about 1/3 of those admitted to the hospital died there. In the ward for the 2 wards for Black patients, children and adults and advanced and early cases were mixed up together because those Black patients were excluded from those pavilions for early cases as well as from that children's pavilion that opened in 1916. The wooden building was considered a fire trap by the end of the decade, and its miserably crowded conditions with one bathroom for every 25 patients became a key argument for the need for a new sanatorium building. This was that new sanatorium building, which I'm sure you all recognize. It's the building that opened in 1926, right next to that original administration building. And it still exists today. This is the structure that's still in southwestern part of Jefferson County. This building is monumental in a number of ways. First of all was its cost of $1 million, which again isn't a lot in money today for a hospital, but then it was. $750,000 of that amount came from a municipal bond passed almost unanimously on Election Day in Louisville in November 1922, so 100 years ago. Second is its striking Tudor Gothic revival design by local architect Arthur Loomis with the assistance of DX Murphy architectural firm. Third was its size, 400 beds with state-of-the-art medical facilities and patient amenities, including a barber shop, a beauty shop, a movie theater, semi-private rooms that opened up to long sun porches on the south side of the building on the 2nd through the 4th floors. It had a dedicated shop for occupational therapy. This photo is, we think is probably circa 1930s. And it's a photograph of the Waverly Hills Sanatorium booth at the State Fair, displaying all the goods made by patients in occupational therapy. People did woodworking, they did painting, they did sewing and embroidery. So again, this was a big thing that patients were engaged in at that new sanatorium. The new sanatorium also hosted regular social events for patients. I love Queen Juanita's dress here on the photo on the left from 1928, and I am very impressed by Queen Sarah and King Cleo's royal attire and makeup in this photo on the right from 1929. These photos are from the diary of James Gabhart. He moved from Henderson County with his wife Mary to Louisville somewhere in the early 1920s, soon after he was diagnosed with tuberculosis at the age of 24. In 3 diaries from 1928 to 1931, James chronicles his time at Waverly Hills, giving daily accounts of what life was like for a seriously ill patient in this new sanatorium. One interesting fact about these diaries is that they were just accessioned by the Filson this past fall. So unfortunately, after the publication of my book in June. So I'm sad that I didn't get the chance to draw on them for the book, but it's pretty amazing to think of all the archival gems still out there, hopefully one day to become publicly available. So I want to spend a bit of time talking about James' diaries and what he writes about. He writes from room 361, which is likely one of the private rooms, a smaller number of private rooms located on the north side of the sanatorium reserved for the sicker patients. James writes first about visiting hours. For him, his wife came every Sunday. His wife, Mary, works as an accountant in Louisville, so she takes visits just on Sundays, since she works during the weeks. Another visiting day was Tuesday, typically. She sometimes brings her young daughter, Martha Lilly, who is 4 years old, in 1928. In one entry, he writes of Sunday evenings after visitors have gone. Quote, "Things quiet with a stillness that is almost unbearable. Everybody has his thoughts, and they are all thoughts of home. It is no easy job to stand at a window and watch your loved ones leave week after week, months and months." His sentiment is echoed by many patients through the years at Waverly Hills. He writes about passing the days alone and sometimes with other patients. In the summer of 1929, he was playing backgammon with another patient in a communal room on the 3rd floor when a group of younger patients gets in a fight with a bunch of grapes. So they're throwing grapes at each other. One of the grapes hits a patient reading. That patient gets mad. He throws a glass bottle at the bunch. The glass bottle inadvertently hits James in the knee. So he deals with an injured knee for the next several weeks. James is only 31 at this time in the summer of 1929, but he is always complaining about the antics and the noise of younger patients on his floor. He occasionally reports their card playing to the head physician, Dr. Oscar Miller. We have his granddaughter in the audience here today. So that's the head person at the sanatorium that James reports card playing to, and he claims that the boys are running, quote, a vice den. For Christmas in 1929, James writes about the American Legion coming to the sanatorium and giving each ex-serviceman a basket of candy, nuts, apples, oranges, and several packs of cigarettes. It was strictly against the rules to have cigarettes at Waverly Hills, and so the nurse supervisor on the floor, Ann Fitzgibbons, comes just a few minutes later with a huge basket to collect all the cigarettes. James writes that the men did not want to give up their packs of cigarettes, but he said they were given no choice. One of this entry here on the bottom right from December 20th, 1930, James is writing about a farm worker who's digging in the dirt down a couple floors under his window. And the farm worker finds a mole. James lets down a cord string, he says. The worker ties the mole to the string. James pulls the mole up to his room, plays with it for the day, gets bored, and then tries to give it away. Not a good day for the mole, but a good example of the ways that sanatorium patients are trying to keep themselves entertained. James writes extensively about his symptoms and his physical condition and his interaction with nurses and physicians. In 1928, soon after he starts the diary, he starts coughing up blood. He is diagnosed with a tubercular larynx, and he is often told by physicians that he needs to rest his throat by not talking, which makes his loneliness and his efforts to pass the time even more difficult. He receives alpine lamp treatment using ultraviolet light on his throat, and then he suffers a burn from that lamp in the summer of 1929. Earlier in 1929, physicians cauterized James' throat with an electric needle and removed 2 ulcers. At this point, his cough is so violent that it causes vomiting. His cough is treated with regular hypodermic injections of codeine. James writes, quote, "I don't like to be taking so much codeine. It is the child of morphine." He starts noting in red ink, as you can see here, when he receives the injection and gets as many as 150 per month. One big concern of patients diagnosed with tuberculosis is dramatic weight loss. Caused by lack of appetite, nausea, and abdominal pain. The patients are weighed regularly at the sanatorium. Sometimes James is not told what his weight is in an effort to keep up his morale if he's lost a lot of weight. In 1930, James convinces his physician to let him take eggnog every day instead of the daily dose of tomato juice and cod liver oil that he had dreaded every morning. James does not write about undergoing any surgical procedures other than the cauterization of his throat. He notes how a few other patients undergo lung collapse therapies. One fellow patient of his on the 3rd floor receives pneumothorax, which is the injection of air into the chest cavity to temporarily collapse the diseased lung to give it time to rest and heal. He says the patient was helped by that procedure. He also talks about 2 other patients who receive
who received the rib removal surgery to remove a few of their ribs to permanently collapse the diseased lung and help the patient with those symptoms. Those patients who received that surgery traveled to St. Anthony's Hospital and Norton's Infirmary to get the surgery. One of them does die at Waverly Hills about 6 months later. James writes about his visits home, and when he first receives an official pass to go home for Thanksgiving in 1928, it's the first time in 14 months that he's gone home. After that fact, he goes home more frequently at Christmas, or he earns passes for Christmas, at Easter, 4th of July, as well as Thanksgiving. When he's home, he's often out and about if he feels well enough to be out and about. He goes to the insurance company, to the bank, the dentist, to church, the clothing store, and the Walnut cafeteria with his family. He always stays home longer than his pass allots. If you can see on here, he's only supposed to be gone, according to these passes, generally for like 3 days. When he gets sick at home, or when he begins to feel like he is a burden on his family, he writes that he's ready to come back to Waverly Hills to rest. In the fall of 1930, things really start to decline. James writes that his physician at Waverly Hills at the time, Dr. Fisher, thinks he is, quote, a dead man, and I know I am. He goes home for Christmas. As the economic crisis of the Great Depression is worsening, his wife finds out that she's lost her accountant job at L&N Railroad. In early 1931, he's back at the sanatorium. His health continues to decline, and so does his relationship with his wife, though she still comes to visit every week. He leaves the sanatorium in May to go home, and all the nurses and Dr. Fisher come to tell him goodbye. He eventually goes to Henderson County to be at his mom's house, where he is taking codeine and morphine. In his last diary entries in late July, he writes of wanting to return to Waverly Hills. According to his death certificate, he dies at the sanatorium on August 8th at the age of 33. There are some bigger points I think we can take from James' experiences. The tragedy of people dying in the prime of their lives was a very real consequence of tuberculosis, which tended to infect younger people, younger adults, more than other age groups. James notes the deaths of a handful of patients over the 3-year period that he keeps his diaries, but he writes much more frequently about feelings of boredom and despondency, and about his and other patients' attempts to keep themselves entertained and occupied. Like many other patients, James is desperate and determined to seek care and fight for his health at Waverly Hills, despite all the hardships. Waiting lists at the institution remained long. They were filled not just with residents of Louisville and Jefferson County, but also out-of-county patients and out-of-state patients trying to gain admission there. In the late 1920s, Waverly Hills restricted admission to only Jefferson County and Louisville residents, and gave preference to lifelong residents because so many people are moving to Louisville to get admitted to Waverly Hills. Also, like many patients, James was desperate to get out of the sanatorium, or at least to get a break. There was nothing medical staff could do to forcibly keep an adult at Waverly Hills. Patients were supposed to get these official passes to leave, but nothing could stop them from just leaving on their own, from staying home longer, as James often did, or simply from not returning. One of my favorite tidbits from the book is from 1945, when the superintendent of Waverly Hills is complaining about a Mr. Garland Petard, who repeatedly leaves the sanatorium to get drunk and then returns. Missing completely from James' diary is any reference to the hospital for Black patients at Waverly Hills. When the new sanatorium, which is pictured here in the center of the photo, when the new sanatorium opens, and this is the sanatorium that James lives at, it opens to white patients exclusively and houses white patients for all but 4 of its 35 years as a tuberculosis institution. And I don't think we can say it's a foregone conclusion that Black patients would be excluded from this building. Black voters were heavily courted for that municipal bond vote in 1922 that funded the sanatorium. And at Louisville's public city hospital, there were duplicate facilities, duplicate patient wings and medical and surgical facilities for white patients and Black patients. So at some point at Waverly Hills, it was decided that the new sanatorium would not have racially segregated wings, but would be, the rooms and the beds would be reserved for white patients. At this point, when it opened in 1926, that old hospital for advanced cases, which is located here on the bottom left of this aerial photograph, that hospital became a separate division for Black patients. A graduate nurse, Esther Behrens, was hired as nurse supervisor, and eventually Dr. Orville Ballard, a Black physician, oversaw the division. So that made Waverly Hills the first white-run medical institution in Kentucky to hire Black medical professionals. The hospital, though, became severely overcrowded fairly quickly, and it doesn't, it's pretty evident just in this aerial photograph, the disparity in spaces and services at the hospital in comparison to that main sanatorium. This photo is from the 1930s. The one on the right, or the building on the right, is again that old hospital for advanced cases that then became a separate hospital for Black patients. The building on the left is the only image I've seen of the new addition that opened in 1933. And it was the Waverly Hills Committee of the City Federation of Colored Women who worked for years with nurse Esther Behrens to get this new addition constructed. As I talk about in the book, an impressively long list of Black women's organizations in Louisville contributed to the care and the comfort of children and adults in these facilities. The addition to me is a good example of how, even in the depths of the Great Depression, Waverly Hills continued to grow with the help of local support and funding. Also during the 1930s, the number of children at Waverly Hills was high. The number continued to be as high as it was in the 1920s. The Louisville Tuberculosis Association during the 1930s ramped up their tuberculosis case finding programs. They regularly screened school children with tuberculin skin tests. If those tests showed had a reaction, then those children would be given x-rays. My daughter loves the story of there was an event once at what was then called Highland Junior High School, where they rolled an x-ray into the school to screen all the children. And the newspaper account covering the event said a fun time was had by all. If the x-ray showed indications of tuberculosis, if the children had been exposed to adults in their household with tuberculosis, or if their parents were patients at the sanatorium, all of those became reasons that children could be admitted to the sanatorium. Since the late 19-teens, at least since then, many of the children at Waverly Hills were called suspects. They were suspected of having tuberculosis because of an exposure to family members. And most of these children had not tested positive for the disease and did not show clinical symptoms. Indeed, I've had a number of people contact me about family members who were children at Waverly Hills in the 1920s and 1930s, but who never had tuberculosis. While medical officials did not have the legal authority to admit adults to the hospital or the sanatorium, they could use a court order to admit children, forcibly admit children to Waverly Hills. If they deemed family members, quote, or if they deemed family members incapable of providing, quote, a proper home or proper care for children. The total average number of patients per day at all the facilities at Waverly Hills reached a high of 500 in 1957. And there are also 250 employees who work there. This is a striking number considering the widespread economic problems and unemployment that existed during the Great Depression. The last period I want to talk about are the years during World War II and especially after World War II, when a number of big changes happened at Waverly Hills. The first big shift is represented by this image on the left. In early 1942, the Louisville Health Department merged with the Jefferson County Board of Health to form a combined entity. At this time, when they merged to form the Louisville Jefferson County Board of Health, they took over control of Waverly Hills Sanatorium. For years, public officials had argued since Waverly Hills is publicly funded, they thought it should be under the oversight of a public agency. So this is the argument for them taking over. The Board of Health at the same time is also overseeing management of City Hospital, which they renamed Louisville General Hospital in 1942. They start to make a number of changes. One of their first big actions at Waverly Hills is opening up the second addition to the hospital for Black patients. It was also designed by D.X. Murphy. You can see it up there on the right. And there's an image of Dr. Orville Ballard below. The Board of Health, along with the medical staff at Waverly Hills, severely or tremendously curtailed the number of children admitted to the sanatorium, with the result that only one child was admitted by 1947. In June of 1946, the Board of Health cut the number of beds at Waverly Hills to 400, so at all of the facilities, to 400 due to budget shortfalls. In October 1946, the Board of Health instituted a new pay policy at Waverly Hills. The previously free institution started charging patients for their treatment if those patients were deemed able to pay for their treatment there, or if they had a newfangled thing called health insurance. This generated a lot of opposition, and many patients in future years simply refused to pay, claiming that they were already paying through their taxes. Here is a very exciting administrative structure, picture of at 1946 of Waverly Hills. And I wanted to talk about a few of the small squares that I think are very important at this time. One of them is the farm located here on the bottom left. At the end of World War II, Waverly Hills doubled the size of its farm to 80 acres. It also restarted its hog breeding program. Both the farm and the hogs helped Waverly Hills provide fresh food to patients and make money for the sanatorium amid rising food prices and food shortages after World War II. The Waverly Hills hogs were cheap to raise. They were fed food scraps and garbage from Waverly Hills, as well as from Louisville General Hospital. And then they brought in profits of up to or more than $10,000 a year. The other two squares I want to talk about are down on the bottom right: occupational therapy and vocational training. Waverly Hills greatly expanded these programs, both at the main sanatorium for white patients and at the hospital for Black patients after World War II. Here are a few of the patients who are helped by these programs that I talk about in the book. Rosetta Squires, she's pictured here on the left. She underwent 2 stays at the hospital at Waverly Hills in the 1940s. She took educational classes and received practical nurse training. After she was discharged as a patient, she went back to Waverly Hills to work as a practical nurse. Her husband, also a former patient, worked there as an orderly. In a Louisville Defender article from 1953, Rosetta said, quote, "I like working at Waverly Hills because I feel that I understand people since I was once sick myself." She would go on to attend Louisville General Hospital Nursing School to become a registered nurse. The Reverend Carl Ligon is pictured here in the middle. He too had 2 different stays at Waverly Hills Hospital in the first half of the 1950s. In between, he attended Payne Theological Seminary in Ohio with his tuition paid for by the Louisville Tuberculosis Association. Like Rosetta, Carl took classes at the sanatorium and wanted to help other patients there in return. In 1956, he told the Louisville Defender about his second stay at Waverly Hills. Quote, "I began teaching Sunday classes, Bible classes, and adult education classes for men who are interested in learning to read, write, and become better citizens." He was discharged from Waverly Hills in the spring of 1956, and he went on to establish the Newburgh Community House and an AME mission. The third photo here pictures young men who are taking part in the rehabilitation program at the main sanatorium, and they're decorating the sanatorium for the Yuletide season. This relates to one of my favorite stories or pieces of information in the book, where there's a group of men taking part in a home economics program at the main sanatorium in the 1950s. And in the article write-up about them, they're learning to make cupcakes with coconut frosting so that they can help their wives when they get out of the sanatorium. So I love that. Staff shortages were a big problem at Waverly Hills after World War II. The institution tried to recruit nurses and physicians and other staff from local schools, from other countries, and by training former patients, as they did with Rosetta Squires. In 1947, the Board of Health launched a new partnership with Meharry Medical College, which was a historically Black medical school located in Nashville, Tennessee. They did this to help alleviate the shortage of physicians at Waverly Hills, as well as a shortage of Black physicians in Louisville. Meharry agreed to send medical students to Waverly Hills Sanatorium for month-long trainings. Dr. Grace M. James, pictured here on the left, was a well-known Louisville physician, and there's a JCPS school named after her today. She and Waverly Hills physician, Dr. Orville Ballard, were the first Black physicians to be appointed to the faculty of the University of Louisville Medical School. Born in West Virginia, Dr. James graduated from Meharry Medical School in 1950. She did a residency and clinical fellowship in New York City and then moved to Louisville in 1953. What is always left out about her in online biographies is something I found out while I was reading through issues of the Louisville Defender. She first came to Louisville as a Meharry medical student to complete a month-long training at Waverly Hills Sanatorium. That is when she was first introduced to Louisville and why she said she returned to Louisville after her time in New York City. The center photo is of Dr. William Moses, who was born in Georgia, graduated from Meharry Medical School in 1949, and became the first Black certified surgeon in Kentucky. According to the Louisville Defender, like Dr. James, Dr. Moses was introduced to Louisville while a Meharry student doing training at Waverly Hills Sanatorium. He said he really liked the city and he decided to come back in 1959 when he joined the medical staff at several local hospitals. After he became chief of the medical staff of Jewish Hospital in 1981, he told the Louisville Defender, quote, "The staff here," meaning at Jewish Hospital, "is warm and their first priority is good patient care. Many programs at the hospital address the humanitarian needs of the community." A third physician pictured here who focused on skilled patient care and the humanitarian needs of the community is Dr. Jesse Bell. He also was a graduate of Meharry Medical School back in 1929, and he came in to Louisville in 1935 to work at Waverly Hills Sanatorium, where he remained until 1947. He also spent about 20 years working for the Louisville Jefferson County Board of Health. There's a wonderful photo in the Louisville Defender from 1964 of a dinner hosted by Dr. Bell and his wife, Geneva Bell, for former employees who had worked at Waverly Hills for 30 years. Unfortunately, the photo was not of a high enough quality for me to reproduce here, but it's a wonderful testament to a strong community of employees at the Black Hospital at Waverly Hills. According to Louisville physician and medical historian Dr. Morris Weiss Jr., Dr. Bell was among the first to receive a dose of the new antibiotic streptomycin after the end of World War II at Waverly Hills. People had high hopes for streptomycin, but many tuberculosis patients had negative reactions to it or developed a resistance to it. Waverly Hills, like other sanatoriums across the United States, began to expand their surgical program in the late 1940s and 1950s and participate in the development of an effective multi-drug therapy for tuberculosis. And this therapy by the 1950s was combining streptomycin with other newly developed drugs like NIH and PAS. At Waverly Hills, starting in 1956, multi-drug treatments were given on an extended outpatient basis for the first time to a growing number of patients, resulting in a steady decline in the number of patients at the sanatorium. We have here our last photo of a sparsely populated sun porch at the main sanatorium from 1960. By the fall of 1959, Waverly Hills had 280 of its 400 beds filled. It had 22 buildings located on 544 acres. At this point, the Kentucky State Tuberculosis Hospital Commission, a state agency, had agreed to take over care of Waverly Hills patients. But there was an issue. The state already managed another tuberculosis sanatorium in Jefferson County, Hazelwood Sanatorium, which I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, as a private sanatorium that was opened in 1907. It was taken over by the state in 1920. Once the state agreed to take over Waverly Hills patients, it soon announced in early 1960 that it would be closing Waverly Hills Sanatorium and moving all the patients to an expanded and renovated Hazelwood Sanatorium. Local residents, former patients, and current employees all fought hard to keep Waverly Hills open, but the last patients were transferred out in June of 1961. Hazelwood Sanatorium itself would remain open just until 1971, when it closed as a tuberculosis institution. The closure of Waverly Hills Sanatorium marked the end of an era, and not just for patients and employees of the institution. The rise and growth in the last years of Waverly Hills represent a significant chapter in the history of Louisville and Jefferson County. Waverly Hills history is important first for what it shows us about local racial dynamics and various institutional arrangements in the first half of the 20th century. Waverly Hills officials excluded Black patients from its original pavilions, then provided a racially segregated hospital, and then created a completely separate division for Black patients once the new sanatorium opened. This division was under-resourced and often overcrowded. It was also one of the few public institutions providing medical training and jobs to Black medical professionals in Kentucky from the late 1920s through the early 1950s. Black leaders and organizations in Louisville and Black staff at Waverly Hills pushed consistently for these structural changes. The history of Waverly Hills is also important in showing how vast and robust Louisville's public health movement was in the early 20th century. This broad movement had the people power and the resources to carry out educational campaigns, to screen mass numbers of children and adults for tuberculosis, and to create a sprawling complex for the treatment of one disease. At its best, Waverly Hills is a quintessential public institution, widely supported by local people who pushed for free treatment and expanded facilities and services for all patients. The strong connection of so many people to Waverly Hills helps to explain why the massive sanatorium building was first constructed and why it has not been demolished. It is my hope that this historic structure serve as a physically powerful way to tell the story of the many different facilities at Waverly Hills and the many different people who fought for health in the face of one of history's most devastating and deadly diseases. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much for that really entertaining lecture. Please get in line at either one of these microphones and ask your questions. We've got a couple that have come in from our virtual audience, so I'll kick off with them. Did many of the nurses or doctors, other caretakers at the facility get tuberculosis from the patients?
Likely so, but there are also a lot of physicians and nurses who worked there because they had tuberculosis. But yeah, there's not a lot of evidence of mask wearing. It's hard to say. We don't have the records of Waverly Hills, the administrative records, until the Board of Health took over. But I mean, tuberculosis passed through prolonged contact with people who have the disease. So we'd assume that some, yes, would contract it.
Well, if you're all gonna be shy, I'm gonna keep going. What was the age range and distribution of patients who die at the facility? Do we see different trends there?
I mean, again, that's hard to determine with the lack of records, but in the early records of Waverly Hills, we have a pamphlet here at the Filson published in 1916, and it breaks down the number of patients by age group and the number of deaths. And most of the patients admitted, as well as most of the patients dying, are in their 20s and 30s. Again, evidence of why this disease was called the captain of all men of death. So because it struck so many at that age.
Well, I guess I was a bit surprised at the examples that you gave of the occupational therapy and you know the nurses training, the ministry training, and I guess that's in the 1950s though. So this
Right.
is a new era where there is now hope with these new drugs for people to be able to find life outside of after treatment themselves.
Right, though I'd say all those programs did they date back to the 1920s, and it did seem, again, covering the period after World War II was much more hopeful to read about some of the patients' experiences there. Although this is still an institution that has a lot of patients with advanced cases of tuberculosis. But undoubtedly, yeah, I have a lot of respect for those programs that did try to engage patients just in helping them pass the time and also serve the purpose of giving them hope to get out of the institution and hope that they could go on to do some kind of work if they were released from the institution. So those programs had a lot of different purposes.
So I have two questions.
Yeah.
So I'll ask the first one, and if it's okay, I'll ask the second one after. But what is going on with the Waverly building now? Do we have any updates as to anything happening there?
Yeah, I'm not connected, and I don't know. When I gave a talk at Carmichael's, I focused on all the conflicts that had happened at Waverly Hills when it was a tuberculosis institution, because there were a lot of fights over ownership and management and how it should be run. And I related that to the conflict going on today, but I'm not connected with that. I'm not sure if a resolution is in place. And it's a hard thing to manage, something that big and dilapidated. If you've ever been out there, I just couldn't imagine the work and the money and the liability insurance that's involved in keeping this structure open and available to the public. So sorry, I can't add a lot.
This is honestly my first time hearing about Hazelwood, and so I'm curious as to why Waverly has remained in like the Louisville vernacular, but I've never heard of Hazelwood before.
Yeah, no, it is odd. And we don't have a lot of records here at the Filson about it. And I think actually a lot, if anyone's interested in doing research in the Hazelwood Sanatorium, the state archives would be where those records would be. And there may actually be a lot more on Hazelwood than there is on Waverly Hills, at least administration records wide. But it became a hospital for patients in the state, and it also became the one state-run hospital out of the handful of hospitals run throughout the state that did surgery. So it served an important role statewide.
I visited Waverly Hills probably about 5 years ago with a friend who was reviewing a book on Waverly Hills.
Okay.
For our book club. And we had a tour, a daytime tour, which was pretty interesting. They focused on paranormal events that people thought were occurring there. And they explained that there was a nighttime tour available for people who were really interested in that, and they could set up video equipment to like visualize ghosts or whatever that might be around. And I know that they had a lot of Halloween decorations there. And I think they have some special Halloween Fright Night.
A haunted house.
Which was pretty interesting. Focusing on people who had died there mysteriously. So
or not so mysteriously if they had
maybe not that mysteriously, you know. I don't believe in any of that, but it was a very amazing how many large buildings there were.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And how elaborate the entrance hall was. If you haven't visited it, I recommend it.
Yeah, I toured with my son in the spring of 2019. It was a beautiful sunny day, and it was an incredible experience. They did ask at the beginning, did we want to hear about ghosts or did we want to hear about history? And I yelled out history really loud. So they talked about both, but it's an incredible, as I call it, this massive artifact of history that you can walk through. And the view from the roof is unbelievable. Again, it was a very clear, sunny day. But just to respond a little bit more to your points, I think there's a whole history to be written about Waverly Hills culturally since its closure, with its reputation as one of the most haunted places on earth. And there's also a whole history to be written about it being used as this prime hangout space for teenagers and adults on the South End in the 1980s and 1990s. I've talked to so many people who spent their teenage years and well into their 20s hanging out at the abandoned building during the 80s and 90s. So a lot of rich stories still to be uncovered and put together.
There was another Louisville General Hospital located out by the Marine Hospital that's now occupied by the Portland Community Health Center. And I've not been able to find out much about that, but apparently it was built in the 30s and had long-term care patients and pulmonary or chest patients.
Oh, wow.
And received patients from Waverly.
So was it
shed any light on that?
Was it one of the health centers? Because the Board of Health did run a number of clinics and health centers around Louisville. Like Waverly Hills was just the peak of the iceberg of the public health infrastructure in Louisville, and there were clinics that fed into, that gave that kind of care and diagnosis you were talking about. But yeah, let me get some information from you afterward. I want to find out more about that.
Hi. So you mentioned the diarist goes home and he doesn't necessarily stay at home. He gets out and about in the community. Does he make any notes about what that was like for him? Was he warmly received? Was he kind of a pariah? Did he make any mention of how a known infected person mixing and mingling away from this hospital? Did he make any mention of
right? No, he did not make any mention at all. And he does worry about when he's home and like his daughter gets sick, and his physician at Waverly Hills is pressuring him to get his daughter examined. which she does go to the hospital at one point, and no mention is made of that afterward. So he's got to have an awareness that he could be spreading this. But we know now tuberculosis is usually, it's not, you're not going to get it in passing with someone, that you do typically need prolonged contact. So it would be his family members he would be more worried about than people at the bank. But it is weird he goes to the dentist, and when they do have a dentist at Waverly Hills at this time as well. So I don't know if it's just he doesn't want to see himself as this, he wants to be out doing these things. He definitely relishes being able to go out to eat with his family. And he the first time he goes to church, he's Baptist, he goes to church. He's like, this is the first time in 2 years, I've been able to do this, and it means a lot to him. So no, that's interesting.
Someone asked what contemporary tuberculosis rates are.
Well, it's still a major killer worldwide, and it ranked only behind COVID as a top infectious disease cause of death after 2020. So I feel like it's just a lot less visible now. A big reason for the high rates today worldwide are because of multi-drug resistant strains of tuberculosis, that to take the multi-drug therapy, you need to do it for a while, many months. You doctors in the audience can speak more to this, but if you take the therapy just for a few months and then you kill off just some of the bacteria, that again creates a stronger bacteria, which can form these resistant strains. So yeah, it's still a major problem. We just, as mostly middle-class people, don't see it as much. It's limited to certain populations. And so I just think it's not as visible, but still a major killer. So yeah, good question.
Well, I think that wraps up our time tonight. Can we have another round of applause? Oh,
there's one question.
We need light.
Okay.